Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on the raising awareness and raising. Oh my God, I made a mistake. Raising awareness about the situation of the newly arrived migrants course. My name is Nair Carrera, and I'm here with my colleague Tassos, who is also a colleague of European Schoolnet. I am one of the moderators of the course, along with my colleague Katia and Katerina, who is also here. And today we're gonna have a great presentation, a very interesting one, hopefully for you. Just so you know, the presentation is gonna be recorded. It's being recorded at the moment, so if you need to leave or whatever, it's fine because we will then share the recording on the relevant section of the course. It will last around 1 hour, so we will first hear to our speaker today, and then we'll have some time for questions that my colleague Tassos here will be gathering them, and we will ask them to the speaker at the end. So you're now working on module 2, which is about raising awareness and fostering informed debate. And in this webinar, our speaker Ruben today will explain what the European Council of Refugees and Exiles is and what it does. Then he will focus on the current situation of the European Union related to the refugees, and he will provide us with an overview of the law and policy changes in the past years. So just so you know him a little bit better, Ruben has obtained a master's degree in criminal law in the University of Leuven, European law in Paris too, and international relations and diplomacy in Antwerp. He has completed internships on the Embassy of Belgium in Paris, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and after all these years, he started working in the ECRE, where he is still working at the moment. His work is mainly focused on legal comparisons between the asylum procedures, detention conditions, reception facilities, and content of protection in different European countries. So, Ruben, correct me if I said something that is not correct. Please feel free to correct me.
No, it's all correct. It's
Okay,
perfect.
so whenever you want, the floor is yours.
Okay.
Thank you.
Shall I
Yes, I will
share my
make.
video as well?
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Is it working now?
Yes, we can see you. Thanks.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I was just introduced, so I don't think I have to introduce myself again. But I'll start by introducing the presentation I'm about to give. So it's named Asylum in the EU, Law, Policy, and a Lot of Misery. Because we've done a lot of changes, both on European level, but also on the national level. But in the end, there's a lot still to think about how to make it better, what to do now. Integration has been the new buzzword. We have a lot of people that have entered Europe that have received asylum status, but what are we going to do with these people? And I think it's very useful to give this presentation. And thanks for organizing this course, because teachers, in my opinion, they play a huge role in this. I think it's very important that from a young age we caress people, we make sure that people feel welcomed. And I think this is something that starts with families, which is very, very important. So I'm happy to speak here. And I'll give you a short overview of what I'm going to say today. So I'll start by explaining the work of ECRE. First of all, because I think the work of ECRE could be useful for you. But on the other hand, also because it's very important to understand what we are doing here, where my organization comes from, and what's happening. There seems to be a bit of a problem with the PowerPoint, if I'm
Yes,
correct.
I am. That's me. Sorry, that's me because I am. Yeah, just give me 1 minute.
Okay, no problem at all.
Okay, just okay. Sorry about this because it was supposed to work with the PPT, but we need to use the PDF, Ruben, as we discussed the other day.
Yeah, no
So
problem.
maybe it's not very well. Okay. Okay, give me 1 minute and I'm on it.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Okay, let's see if it works now. Okay, so it should be uploading now. Can you see it? Okay,
I can see upload in progress.
converting. Okay, I don't know what for some reason the PPT failed, but it's fine.
No problem. Technology is always a bit
Yeah.
difficult.
So in the meantime, if the speakers want, or the speakers, the participants want to share with us where they joining from, please do so, so that we know where are you in the world. We are here in Brussels, Tassos and me, Katerina as well. Ruben, where are you?
I'm in Brussels as well.
Okay, and the rest of the participants, if you want to share where you're joining. Okay, so we got Germany. Okay, okay, it should be there. Can you see it now?
Yes, I can see
Okay,
it.
so it's the same thing, but if you want to play up with the zoom a bit so that it's a bit. Okay, I think this way is better, right?
Yeah, this is perfect.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Sorry for the inconvenience. Thanks.
No problem at all. So I was just explaining what I'm about to talk about today. So starting with the work of ECRE, then I'll discuss the crisis because it's a word we've been hearing a lot the past years. But what is this crisis? Where did it come from? What did we do about it? What are the policy changes that the EU tried to make? And are they actually working, all these changes? And then finally, I'm going to talk about the asylum lottery. You can see the hashtag in front of Asylum Lottery. And so if some of you are using Twitter or you're interested in tweeting about this, feel free to use the hashtag Asylum Lottery. It's something we've been working on for the past days. So it will be good to get it out there. You're obviously not obliged to do that, but it will be pretty cool. So I'll start by talking about ECRE itself. What is ECRE? ECRE is short for the European Council on Refugees and Exiles. It's an alliance founded in 1974, which is an umbrella organization. That means we are the secretariat and we have 98 organizations that are members. These 98 member organizations are situated in 39 European countries. The mission of ECRE is to promote the establishment of fair and humane asylum policies and practices in accordance with international human rights law. We have a website which is called www.ecre.org, and I invite you all to visit it. You can find a lot of stuff there. I think what will be very interesting for you is to see where our members are located. I've made a little map that shows the different members we have all over Europe. The map is not super updated, but it does give you quite a good overview of who our members are. And I've seen that many of the participants of this course are from Italy, Portugal, Greece. So I've singled those countries out to give you some examples of our members. So in Italy, we've got ASCI, the Italian Council for Refugees, Mosaico, and Oxfam Italia. In Portugal, we have the Portuguese Refugee Council, of whom the director is actually here at the moment. And in Greece, we've got ITIMA, the Greek Council of Refugees, and Klimaka. But that's not all. We also have some international members. These are names that will probably ring a bell, such as Amnesty International, the Jesuit Refugee Service, and the International Rescue Committee. Our members are, we have a good bond with our members. We connect with them on a daily basis depending on the topic. As you'll see later in my presentation, we have a couple networks that are either focused on litigation or on policy. And we use these networks that consists of people in these member organizations to often connect among each other. It's also very easy to flag issues. For instance, when our members in Lithuania flag us, guys, we have a huge problem in Lithuania, and we see the same problem in Sweden, and we see it as well in Finland and in Greece. We could think of, we need to do something about this. We could go to the institutions, the European Parliament, the European Commission, which is all located here in Brussels and is very convenient for us. And we can go there and do the advocacy on behalf of these organizations. So we try to keep a close bond with them, but obviously we have also separate things we work on. Not everything ECRE does represents every single member. Not everything every single member does represents ECRE. It's usually very well indicated, but it can be very forceful. We can send a very strong message as an organization that on some point where we get the agreement of all our members, when we then put forward a statement of almost 100 organizations in Europe, that obviously resonates pretty loudly here in Brussels with the policymakers. So what is it that we do here at ECRE? We do a lot of stuff, a lot of stuff. So this is a slide where we show our activities. It's divided in four pillars. These four pillars are legal support and litigation, legal policy research, advocacy, and communications. Um, the legal support and litigation is focused on case law. It consists of two main things that I'll single out a bit later in this presentation, which is EDAL and ELENA. EDAL is short for the European Database on Asylum Law, and it's an online database on which I'll explain more in a minute. ELENA is a European legal network of asylum lawyers. The word says it itself. It's a network of lawyers focusing on asylum. But I'll also explain a bit more on that. Then you've got the legal and policy research division, which is the part where I personally work in, where we have two main things that we work on. We've got the Common European Asylum System. I believe you're familiar with that concept from the earlier days of this course. And then there's IDA, which is the Asylum Information Database, which is a database on the asylum procedures, reception conditions, detention, and the content of protection in 20 different countries. The third pillar of our work is advocacy. We focus our advocacy on three separate projects, separate topics. This is external affairs, children, and then there's the RISE network, um, which is obviously also complemented by advocacy on the Common European Asylum System. But given that Common European Asylum System is a bit broader than just advocacy, but also research and legal, it fits in both categories basically. And then the final pillar is communications. Communications is obviously very important for an international organization. You need to reach out to the people because as much as it might be useful to reach out to policymakers, to parliamentarians, it's also very, very important to reach the broad public, to change the narrative that has been going on for the past years. The narrative has been so negative and has been marked by disinformation and, as some people call it, fake news, that we think it's very important to have a strong communication department and to communicate to every layer of society with correct, up-to-date information. So first I'll explain the IDA project. As I just explained, IDA is a database, an internet database, which you can find at www.asylumineurope.org. It's a project, it started out as a project in 2012 to check the implementation of European laws, to check how national countries would actually transpose these European laws in their national laws. So what we've seen is that this has been extremely useful, which is why we've expanded it. It started with 12 countries, now we're at 20. And the main instrument of this are the country reports. So you can see a little map on the slide, and this map has the flags of 20 countries in there. On the website, you can click on a country. When you click on a country, you can read the country report. This country report is rather big. But if, for instance, you're a teacher in Greece or Spain or France or wherever you are, and you see that your country is on this little map, it might be very useful for you to read these reports. The reports, they're rather lengthy. They're about 100 pages each, but there's also a summary in the beginning. They're very useful because they give an overview of the asylum procedures, the reception conditions, detention, and the content of international protection. And this part, content of international protection, is what happens when a person is recognized as a refugee. What do these people get? In some countries, this means literally nothing. And they just say, from here on, just see what happens. And you can end up very well, but you can also end up starving in the streets. In other countries, you get social assistance, you get a residence permit for many years. So this is very fluid and depends on every country. It's a chapter that we've only included this year, and a big part of my presentation, the asylum lottery stuff, is actually focused on that. What do you get once you're recognized? These reports are used a lot. They're used in courts, they're used by lawyers, but they're also used by the general public when they want to know something more about the asylum system in their country. So I think that's where it becomes very handy for you teachers. If you're interested in what exactly happens when a person arrives at the airport or at the border, it's very easy to go to this report and check the relevant chapters. or what happens when people are in reception centers. Some of you might be teachers that teach to children that are still seeking asylum that have not yet received refugee status or subsidiary protection. So I think it's very useful then to see what the conditions are in these reception centers. There's a chapter called Conditions in Reception Centers where you can literally see the different places where children and families are received and are staying and sleeping, and you can see sometimes the terrible conditions, really, where a lack of hygiene. And I think that would also be very useful in your way of communicating with children. But these country reports is not the only thing we have on this website. We have a very big comparative dimension, um, which is divided in three topics. We've got the comparator, comparative reports, and legal briefings. These are three instruments where we compare what Europe says we should do, and then what the national countries do. And then we say, this country is doing quite well. This country is not doing great. And then we advise. We don't specifically advise the countries, but we do advise Europe, the European Union, saying if you change your wording or if you change your law, this would be implemented better. Another thing you see on the slide is ECRE missions. We sometimes, which is usually once a year, we conduct a fact-finding mission, as we call it. We go see ourselves how the conditions are in these countries. Because obviously, since we're based in Brussels, we don't know every single detail about every country, which is why our country reports are co-written by national experts and by ECRE itself. So national experts, experts on the ground, usually from our member organizations, which is the first time where they come in very, very handy. These reports give us a very good look about what's happening on the ground. And then with these fact-finding missions, once a year, we go check in certain locations what's actually happening, which is usually when we're highlighted by our members or when we see that different members have an issue with a country or with conditions in the country. I'll go to the next database now, which, as I explained, is the online database of the asylum law, the European database of asylum law. And this is where our cases are stored. For instance, when there's a very important case in your country, um, about asylum, about, for instance, people not being accepted or reception conditions not being to the standards they need to be. This is often, you can often find this on this website. The website contains judgments not only from national countries, but also from the European Court of Justice and from the European Court of Human Rights. And why we have this database is in order to have a bit more harmonizing standards, to promote the quality and consistency of decision making. But this is then the litigation department that consists of IDAL and now the second part of ELENA. ELENA is the European Network on Asylum. It consists of legal practitioners. So it's a network of over 500 lawyers based all over Europe. And these lawyers they notify us of important cases in their countries, so we can perhaps put them on our website. But they also ask us for information. When, for instance, there's been a case in Belgium that could be of relevance to a case in Portugal, the Portugal lawyer can ask us, what was the exact deal in Belgium? What was happening there? And so this is why we use this network to create a bit of a European standard in cases as well. Other outcomes of the online network are research papers, which are then based on information that is given by these lawyers. And we also have an Elena seminar, which is a very interesting 2-day seminar meant for lawyers who can then discuss these topics in real life, facing each other. And then there's the Elena Weekly Legal Update. And I think if there's people among you with a legal interest, this could be very useful for you, because the Elena Weekly Legal Update gives you an overview of what the legal developments have been in countries. Then there's the Advocacy Department. The Advocacy Department is focused on external affairs, children, the RISE network, and then integration. This is a bit Brussels based and Brussels focused. So the external affairs talks about the external dimension of asylum policy. These people often work in working groups together with other NGOs to liaise in preparing joint statements, preparing common advocacy strategy and information sharing. On children, we just finished a project that was called No Longer Alone. The project was meant to contribute to the improvement of reception standards for unaccompanied children by creating a space for discussion among national and local level stakeholders. And then there's RISE, which is very interesting. RISE is a project that is co-hosted by ECRE and by the Greek Forum of Refugees. And it's meant for refugees to be able to recommend and to share their knowledge and experience to improve policies at the European level. So there's a lot of refugees in the board of this project. And then recently we've also started working on integration, because integration is the new buzzword in European politics. So on the next slide, you have the final pillar of ECRE's work, which is communication. As I've previously explained, I personally think communication is highly, highly important in these times where populism is often in newspapers. Politicians are saying blatantly false statements in order to get more votes. So we think it's very important to have a strong communication network and to be able to put out the news, the facts the way it is, and to also give positive news, because there are positive developments. The fact that such a huge amount of teachers is apparently interested in a course on refugees is, in my opinion, great news. I've seen a little map of your location in Europe, and I think it's amazing that so many people are interested in this, and so many people want to work on this and are helping to contribute to a better society. And so I think we need to reach out to all of you, which is why I would suggest to like us on Facebook, on Twitter, to follow us. Our Twitter handle is @ECRE, and on Facebook we're just called European Council on Refugees and Exiles. But if you type in ECRE, you can also find it. Other things this communication network does is the EMON group, which is the European Media Officer Network, where we try to have common communication standards with some of our members in order to do joint statements and all that. And then, which is why I put it in bold, which is what could be the most interesting for you, is the weekly bulletin. Um, and I think the weekly bulletin is something that for most of you will be a very interesting read. Because as I just explained, the legal update gives you an overview of legal developments, but you might not be interested in law. I can totally understand that. I've studied it for a long time and it's not always interesting. But this weekly bulletin gives you an overview of what is happening in a country, not legally, but in a situation. For instance, in our weekly bulletin of last week, it said that Hungary had implemented a new law which said that you could detain every asylum seeker. So as soon as you enter the territory, you can be detained. You can be put in jail. You don't necessarily need to do something wrong. You can just be put in jail anyway. So we put these developments in there. These developments are both national developments, but also European developments. For instance, ECRE has commented on European laws, or Europe has a new initiative. These developments can be positive or negative, which is why I think it's the main tool if you want to stay up to date of what is happening in the situation of refugees all over Europe. I would suggest one thing, and that is to read the weekly bulletin. You can find the link to subscribing for the weekly bulletin on our website, ecre.org. So now to the second part of this presentation, but first I'm going to take a sip of water because this is exhausting. If I'm going too fast or if I'm speaking not clear enough, please notify me of that. I'm just rambling on and I'm very passionate about this topic, so I love
It's
talking about
perfect,
it.
Ruben.
But if something is not clear, feel
It's
free
great,
to ask.
thank you. Perfect.
Okay. So let's talk about this crisis thing. It's the word. It's a crisis. You hear words like we're being flooded, which is what I think is a bit overly dramatic. You see politicians suggesting to put border fences, put people in jail. So I think it's important first to discuss a couple of numbers. And I've listed some numbers over here. For instance, there are at this moment an unprecedented number of 65.3 million, 63.5 million people around the world have been forced from home. Among these people, there are 21.3 million refugees, over half of whom are under the age of 18. So imagine this is over 10 million of people under 18 currently out of their own country looking for refuge in a different country. Nearly 34,000 people a day are forcibly displaced around the world. Just let that sink in for a moment. 34,000 people a day. I don't know in which cities you live, but the village I was born in doesn't even have 34,000 people a day. But every day, this amount of people somewhere in the world has to flee from random violence. 53% of the refugees worldwide come from Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia. So from just these three countries, 53% of all refugees come. The top hosting countries are Turkey, Pakistan, Lebanon, Iran, Ethiopia, and Jordan. So as you notice, none of these countries is European. It's Turkey, Pakistan, Lebanon, Iran, Ethiopia, and Jordan. So this is not a European problem, as the amount of refugees show, as the hosting countries show. This is not a European problem. Only 6% of the world's total displaced population is hosted in Europe. You can compare this 6% to the 40% of the world's total displaced population that is hosted in the Middle East and North Africa. So as you can see on the slide, in 2015, 1 million people entered Europe, and in 2016, half a million. So if you compare this, for instance, to Turkey, where they alone have 3 million refugees living in their country, these numbers don't even make sense. The European Union has 508 million inhabitants. These 508 million inhabitants now receive 1 million refugee, compared to a country like Lebanon, where they have 4.5 million inhabitants, but they do host 1.5 million refugees, which is amazing. That's 1 in 4 in that country is a refugee, compared to the 1 million in 2015 out of our 508 million. That's a huge difference. And the majority of people entering Europe is in fact entitled to international protection. Because what you often hear in media is that a lot of these people are gold seekers. They come here to find luck. But what we see is that over 70% of the people entering Europe receive refugee status. So it's clear that it's not the majority looking for money or looking for a better life. It's the majority of people running from war and running from persecution and violence. On the next slide, we can see some of the causes of these people, why these people come to Europe. These are the main countries where they come from are Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq, and Eritrea. These are not new situations. These are not wars that were started last week, nor last month, nor even last year. The situation in Syria has been going on for over 6 years now. 6 years now. Afghanistan, equally long, a lot longer even. And Somalia is even crazier. Um, we saw these issues coming. We knew that there were wars in these countries. We've been talking about refugees for, what's it, 2 years now, maybe three, but the war in Syria has been going on for twice as long. So we act like we're surprised that people come to Europe. But isn't it, as a policymaker, your duty to actually realize that people were going to flee from this situation? Um, these are situations that last for a long time. The oldest refugee camps in the world are in Kenya. These are named Dadaab and Kakuma, and they have been there for over 25 years. Refugees camps that have existed for over 25 years. There are people who were born in refugee camps and are now 25 years old. This is not a temporary solution. A refugee camp is not a durable solution. People living in tents is not a durable solution. You need to you come up with an actual solution for these people, which obviously starts in the countries of origin. You need to start with making sure that in these countries there's no more war. But as long as there's no more war, you need to find a solution to make sure that these displaced people are taken care of. Because research has shown, and the European Commission has also endorsed this research, that displacement periods tend to last on average 10 years for people who are trapped within their country in a certain region, and 25 years for refugees. So the problem is you cannot go back within a year. These periods of displacement take a mere 25 years. So what could have been a solution, but is not a solution because we have this crisis? There is no safe and legal access for those in need of protection. There is no legal way to enter Europe. There is no way for these people to enter Europe without risking their lives by crossing either the Mediterranean Sea or crossing several dangerous routes amongst gangs and bribes and there's just no way. There's a few ways that could be used. For instance, there's the issue of humanitarian visas, where people can apply for a humanitarian visa and then come to the country. And they can take a plane and they do not have to risk their lives before they enter Europe. However, this is something that has been very scarcely used in Europe in the past years. Um, but not to be too negative, I'm going to give a good example. France opened a humanitarian corridor for 500 people just last week. So France allowed 500 people from Syria to cross the border to Lebanon and then take a plane to France where they can apply for asylum, which is, in my opinion, a very good development because these people are fleeing Syria. So they are coming somewhere. And no matter where they are going to, they will have to risk their lives. But thanks to France's initiative now, this humanitarian corridor, at least these 500 people will not have to risk their lives in order to reach safety. Another reason why these people arrive irregularly in Europe is that they get smuggled in. Because what do you do when there is no legal way to enter Europe? Well, you get smuggled in. 90% of the people arriving in 2015 have used smugglers either in Europe or outside of Europe. It's estimated that there are currently over 40,000 smugglers operating in Europe. So what you hear often in the discourse of the European Union is we need to break the smuggler's business model. So what is often suggested as a solution is that we build a wall. We build walls, we build fences, so that smugglers will not be able to come in. But research has shown, and in my opinion, it's only logical, that when you build a wall, what is a smuggler going to do? Well, a smuggler is going to look for a more dangerous route. A smuggler is just going to look for a hole in the fence or to circumvent the fence. So what has happened when a smuggler looks for a more dangerous route? Well, the price gets higher for the refugees to pay because often these people have to pay more than my year's salary, which is not super high, but more than my year's salary just to enter Europe, just to be able to take a super dangerous route, climbing over fences, circulating fences. So these smugglers will ask for more of these refugees. They ask for trafficking often, meaning that people get smuggled in and then have to work for these smugglers, often in prostitution. And what will happen as well is, it makes sense when you take a dangerous route, it becomes more deadly. And that is something that we have seen. We have seen that a lot of the Balkan route has been closed, so there's less traffic among the Balkan route. So what happens? More and more people cross the Mediterranean Sea. And so what happens when you cross the Mediterranean Sea? Well, you die. The sad thing is, you die. The amount of death on the Mediterranean Sea in 2016 is the highest that we have ever seen. So building walls is not the solution, because by building walls, it's to the detriment of refugees. But who's happy when you build walls? Certain types of politicians. So that's why building walls has been labeled as a politically successful, but in fact failing policy. So this is another reason why this has become a crisis. The smugglers who try to get people in, the politicians who exaggerate everything and try to build walls, convincing people that we need to build walls to keep people out, even though this is clearly failing. So the next slide shows you some more causes, some more internal causes. One of these causes is a common European asylum system. The body of legislation in the European Union that treats with asylum is called the Common European Asylum System. You might have heard something about this in your course already. It's pretty technical, it's pretty legal, but most of all, it's not working. It's not working because what we see is that certain countries don't really care. When the Common European Asylum System says you cannot detain people without any reasons, there are countries like Hungary who say, well, we will do it anyway. Um, Other things that are happening, which are totally not allowed under the Common European Asylum System, is pushbacks. People at the border asking for asylum, yet still get refused entry of the country. This has happened in 2016 in Austria, Croatia, Spain, Greece, Hungary, Bulgaria, Poland. There's plenty of examples. And these things are all not allowed by the European asylum system. Yet countries don't seem to care, which is what causes a crisis. Because obviously, if people will follow the rules, things might go a bit better, but the rules are not constructed correctly and the rules are not followed. So secondly, there's also a lack of solidarity in Europe. One of the things Europe tried to do is have a relocation system. Currently, countries like Greece and Italy are having to bear the burden of the refugee arrivals in Europe. That is because we have a system which is called the Dublin system, and the Dublin system says that every country at the border, when people arrive there, they have to ask asylum there, and they cannot continue to other countries. Because when they continue to other countries, what happens is these people will be returned to the first country. So they will be returned to either Italy or Greece or Hungary or wherever they come from. This is very expensive, these returns, yet they are still happening a lot. So what did we try to do? Is the European Union tried to come up with a solution that would lift some of the pressure on these countries. So all the other countries in Europe would take a certain share of the people in Italy and in Greece, and they would recept them in their own country so that Italy and Greece will have a bit less work. Sadly, we have seen that this is not working at all. Often countries are just not participating, like Poland. Some countries also actually challenged this system in front of the European Court of Justice, saying that the EU has no right to impose this on them. Slovakia and Hungary have done this. Other countries have participated, but have only participated with very low numbers. And to begin with, the number that was set to be relocated was too low anyway. So even though the European Union set a very low threshold for these countries, it's still not being complied with. And the European Union gave these countries 2 years in order to fulfill this obligation. These 2 years are ending in 5 months, and hardly anything has been done. There's a lot of work, and I personally doubt that they will relocate the amount of people that they promised to relocate. What's also funny is the combination between these relocation system and the Dublin system. So actually, some countries have returned more people to Italy than that they have taken from Italy under the relocation scheme. So under Dublin, they have returned people, people that had to ask for asylum in Italy, but then continued their journey. So what did these countries say? Oh well, according to the Dublin regulation, you go back to Italy. On the other hand, the European Union has a system saying, you know, country, we need a bit of solidarity. Take some people from that country. And so they take less people than they send back. So the European Union devised this relocation scheme intending to lift the pressure, but because of countries' lack of solidarity, no country is lifted, and countries at the border, like Italy and Greece, are still left with a lot more pressure than other countries. And then there's the third part that is often referred to in politics, which is the fact that at this moment there's a bit of a political legitimacy crisis. People don't believe in the current politicians. People don't believe in extremes, polarization, and it's often refugees who have to pay the burden to stop this polarization of societies. What we've seen in the most recent elections in the Netherlands is that the super right-wing politician Geert Wilders did not get the amount of votes that he wanted, And so often it was portrayed as if he lost because, he wanted a certain threshold of vote and he did not reach that. But the way Wilders actually won is because his ideas, his radical extremist ideas, entered into the mainstream debate. And a lot of political parties have shifted their own political views more and more to the right and more to this extreme polarization of society. And so that's a way that refugees have been the burden. Because a lot of these countries with non right wing politicians have still adopted right wing measures in order to stop the rise of politics, of populist political parties. So we've established that there is a crisis. This crisis is due to the arrival, to the wars in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Eritrea, and Somalia, to the fact that there is no legal way to enter Europe, to the fact that a lot of people get smuggled in, to the fact that our European laws are not working properly, to the fact that there's a lack of solidarity between the countries, and to the fact that politics in general is being more and more polarized. So what did Europe do about this? Because obviously, when there's a problem, you need to come up with a response. People were looking to the EU to find a response. And the EU has done a lot of things. They are focused on three pillars, the internal pillar, the border pillar, and the external pillar. So internally, the EU has placed a lot of restrictions and they have limited protection in the EU. They have tried to make the EU as unattractive as possible for refugees, basically saying, you'd be better to go somewhere else. They've done this by legislative reforms, and they have reformed the common European asylum system. Several proposals has been tabled over in 2016, which are now under discussion in the European Parliament. And on the website of ECRE, you can also find our comments on these proposals, which are very, very legal, but I think they're very interesting to show that what the EU thinks we should do. And I've highlighted some of the things, for instance, penalizing secondary movements. For instance, there's this system in Europe which is called long-term residence status, meaning that if you've stayed as a third country national, let's say you're Mexican, and you've stayed in Europe for 5 years, then under certain conditions you can be granted long-term residence status, and that way you get a bit more rights. Your rights are closer to the rights of a native-born European Union citizen. This exists also for refugees, but in the new proposals, the European Union has tried to make it more difficult for refugees to be granted long-term residence status. So, for instance, when you're recognized as a refugee in Belgium and you get a working opportunity in the Netherlands, it is very hard and basically impossible for you to go work in the Netherlands because you're recognized in Belgium, which is a bit funny because we call it a common European asylum system, but there is no positive recognition, common positive recognition. So a refugee in Belgium needs to get his status recognized in the Netherlands before he can actually work in the Netherlands. But if you still do so, if you are not aware of this, and you get found in a second country, which is not the country that has granted you asylum, then this 5 year waiting period before you can grant a long-term residence status just starts over again. So you might have been living in Europe for 4 years as a refugee, almost having reached long-term residence status, which grants you more rights. If you're apprehended in a country that is not the country that has granted you rights, well, too bad. Then you will have to start again. Which is basically the EU has opted to disincentivize and punish people. Whereas we at ECRE, we think it's a lot more useful to incentivize people, to offer people a future idea. And we propose to lower this threshold to 2 years if people comply. So if people stay within their country for 2 years, then you grant them long-term residence status. That way, people will be more happy to comply with this. So we want to offer people things instead of punishing them things when they take something. Another thing is we're maintaining the Dublin system. I've just explained to you that the Dublin system is not working. People do make these secondary movements. The pressure on Italy is mounting, yet we still send people back. Yet the European Union has decided to keep the Dublin system, and even without having a permanent relocation system. They've only installed a trigger mechanism, meaning that if there's pressure on one of the countries on the side of Europe, then eventually you need to have a lot of pressure for this to be triggered. Then eventually there could be a solidarity mechanism if people comply. And this is a very contentious point in negotiations. So it's not even sure that this will actually happen. And we might just keep the Dublin system the way it is. And the way it is that it's broken. It's not working. Then the second part where the EU has made changes is at the borders. So we've first tried to make it not attractive, and the second part is the borders. Even though it's not attractive, people are still coming to Europe. So what we try to do is to keep people out. We keep people out in two ways, both physical and legal. The legal concept is called inadmissibility. This is a concept which allows countries to process asylum claims in a different procedure than the regular one. This leads to procedures with shorter deadlines and less safeguards. The EU-Turkey deal, which you probably know, is based on this. It's based on the notion of a safe third country. And in order to be a safe third country, a refugee needs to have a connection with this country, and the country needs to give sufficient protection. In previous years, sufficient protection meant that people need to have the same rights as refugees as in Europe, meaning they needed to adhere to the 1951 Geneva Convention. And a connection meant that, for instance, you could have a family member there, or a spouse, or anything like that. Now, what we've seen in recent years is that Turkey did not reach this threshold. Turkey was not considered a safe third country for people passing from Syria to Europe. So what has happened? The EU has now said that if you transit through a country, meaning if you walk to a country or you take the bus by through a country, you have a sufficient connection with that country. So transit through a geographically close location is the new wording that can be found in the proposal. Um, and so this is an incredible lowering of standards just to make sure that Turkey would fit in this criterion. Another thing that has been applied to Turkey is that Turkey does not fully accept the 1951 Geneva Convention. And this 1951 Geneva Convention is the bedrock of asylum law. But Turkey has a geographical limitation, meaning that Turkey does not recognize people from outside of Europe as refugees, as literally refugees. So what the EU has now said, instead of the previous standards that you needed to have protection as refugees, the EU now has said you need to have sufficient protection, which needs to be rather equal to the substantive parts of the Geneva Convention. Meaning not every part, meaning you do not have to adhere by the standards of the bedrock of asylum law. But by lowering these standards again, the EU was allowed to do this deal with Turkey. And so now these things are getting mainstreamed. We use them for Turkey, but now we're trying to use them more and more in other countries as well, which is what we see in the third part, the external part. We're trying to outsource our problem, basically saying if the refugees are outside of Europe, it's not Europe's problem anymore. But as we've seen before in this presentation, it has never been Europe's problem. With this 1,215,000 compared to the 1.5 million living in Lebanon, a country of 4.5, you cannot declare this a European problem. But the EU is thinking lately, you know what, if we keep them out, other countries will solve it. Um, so this is why we've devised a lot of new things called the partnership framework, for instance, which is deals that we're trying to make with Senegal, Mali, Ethiopia, Lebanon, Niger, Jordan, and Nigeria. So the deals that we're making with these countries is we're trying to link development aid with migration and security measures. Basically saying we will help you and give you the development aid we're giving you anyway, only on the conditions if you, for instance, install fences, or if you install cameras, or if you get border police at the border and more army at the border. So we give more and more money for securitization measures. What research has shown, and there's a very interesting study on this by the Klingendahl Institute, that has shown that this is not going to solve the problem. The problem of migration, for instance, in these countries, named Senegal, Mali, Ethiopia, Niger, and Nigeria, the problem there is much deeper. The problem goes to a whole economic system that lies beneath the reason why people migrate. People migrate not only because of wars and because of persecution, but also because climate change, because lack of opportunities in countries, or because they simply get forced to, or they get smuggled or trafficked. And there's a whole economic scheme behind this. There are gangs, there are smugglers, there are authorities participating with bribes, um, and it's this that we need to attach importance to. It's this situation where we need to take care of. We don't need to install cameras to see who's crossing the border when. We need to see why these people are migrating. We need to go to the course, to the roots of this problem. And what I personally think is that this partnership framework, basically offering money for security measures, is not going to solve the problem because you do not develop a country, you do not create opportunities in those countries. Other suggestions that have been made is a deal with Afghanistan. We call this the joint way forward with Afghanistan, um, which is a nice way for a very dirty deal that has seen a lot of people returned to Afghanistan, even though several reports recognize that the situation in Afghanistan is the worst that it has been in years. Um, but still, we try to make deals with Afghanistan, making sure that we can return people to parts of Afghanistan. Another thing which you can find on the slide is the Australia or Austria ID. Um, it was suggested by that the junior minister of foreign affairs in Austria, saying he said that we should have an idea just like Australia. And the system in Australia is that every refugee that arrives um, in Australia gets put on an island. One of these islands is called Nauru, and the refugees are put on an island, and they are locked up on an island, and they can't move on the island. And there is extensive Amnesty International documentation on the incredibly huge amount of human rights violations that are done on this island. And this is actually a suggestion that was literally proposed by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Austria. So he just basically promoted, let's do a human rights violating policy. So these are the three responses that Europe has been given. Um, so that brings me to the third part of this presentation, which will focus on what is happening to these people once they arrive in Europe, once you get a status. Um, I've named this part Asylum Lottery. I'll tell you in a second why I named it Asylum Lottery. And I think this part is something that for you teachers is of great importance because you will be confronted with refugees or beneficiary subsidiary protection beneficiaries in your classroom. And these people, they have received status, contrary to a lot of other people who do not receive status and get returned and all this stuff. But these people have received status. But that does not mean that everything is fine. That does not mean these people are incredibly happy or have no worries anymore. Um, and I'll try to explain some of this stuff. But before I can explain this, I need to explain that EU member states grant two different types of protection to people receiving asylum. Um, so the EU has created a two-tier protection regime, granting refugee status to some and beneficiary protection, subsidiary protection status to others. Refugee status is for persons qualifying as refugees under the 1951 Geneva Convention, whereas subsidiary protection is granted to those who do not meet the criteria for refugeehood, but they still face serious harm due to certain human rights violations in their country of origin, which is often random violence, not specifically targeted to a person, but it doesn't matter whether the bomb is exactly targeted to your house or to your whole village. And this distinction that the European Union made is based on the false assumption that subsidiary protection status addresses shorter term protection needs compared to refugee status. However, the European Commission has already admitted that practical experience acquired so far has shown that this initial assumption was not accurate at all. And so even though the goal of the European Union was noble, the goal being protecting people faced with generalized violence or events seriously disrupting public order, the approach is different from, for instance, what the Organization of African Unity did and the 1984 Cartagena Declaration, where refugeehood was extended to people facing these problems, and thus people in both situations are treated on the same footing, on the higher footing, on refugee status footing. But not so in Europe. In Europe, refugees and subsidiary protection beneficiaries are legally and normatively distinct. So to understand this, I'll explain a bit more about the Common European Asylum System. The goal of the Common European Asylum System is hidden in the word itself. The EU tries to have harmonized rules and equivalent protection standards throughout the continent. The existence of such common legislative framework of common standards and shared financial resources, practical cooperation supported by the EU, is supposed to ensure that people seeking protection are treated equally in every member state of the EU. Whether you arrive in Belgium or in Bulgaria, this is supposed to be the exact same. That is what is meant by a common European asylum system. So whatever country you arrive in, everything's supposed to be the same standards. However, this assumption has never been realized in practice, and European countries make widely different determinations as to who needs international protection, what form of protection is needed, and what rights are attached to this protection. And that's why we call it an asylum lottery, because depending on what country you arrive on, you might receive international protection status or not. You might receive refugee status, but you might also receive subsidiary protection status. And depending on what status you get, your rights may be quite high, your rights may be quite level, it all depends. So that's why we call it the asylum lottery. Still, feel free to tweet with the hashtag asylum lottery. You will also, if you go to the Twitter of ECRE, you will also find some quotes on the asylum lottery that are shared yesterday, today, and in the coming days they will be shared. So you're very clear um, to share these, to show these to people, but you will see the pictures in the next part of my presentation. Because extensive reforms across several member states in the course of 2016 have created a bigger difference in treatment between refugees and subsidiary protection beneficiaries. So depending on what status you get, the differences can be huge. And I'll show you on the next slide that there is still a high recognition rate in many countries. So still, people arriving in Europe often receive status. You see countries such as the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and Sweden that all have recognition rates over 70%, with Malta even having a 90% recognition rate. So 90% of the people arriving in Malta receive refugee status or subsidiary protection status. And so in other countries, Netherlands, Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, and Austria, these numbers are also quite high. Other countries are a bit mixed, like Belgium with 60%, Serbia with 51%. But then there's also countries where we see that a very, very low number of people are recognized as refugees or subsidiary protection beneficiaries. For instance, you can see Poland and Hungary with very, very low. Poland 16.5 and Hungary 8.4. Bulgaria and Greece also have rather low numbers, but you can see that there's a very big difference in people being recognized. You can see the UK with 33, Ireland with 23, but then go back to Spain with 66. So even though we call this a common European asylum system, it's very strange because the people arriving are apparently very, very different. But so we'll see on the next slide that this is not necessarily true. We see that it's a lottery. And what do we mean with this lottery? We mean that a perfect example is Afghanistan. So when you come from Afghanistan and you arrive in Italy, Switzerland, or France, your recognition rates are very high. 97% in Italy, 89 in Switzerland, and 82 in France for people coming from Afghanistan. But when you're coming from Afghanistan and you arrive in Hungary or you arrive in Bulgaria, in Hungary you will only have a 6% chance of receiving status, whereas in Bulgaria you only have a 2.5% chance of receiving status. And this is for people fleeing from largely similar circumstances in Afghanistan, sometimes even in the exact same situation. In general, over Europe, we can observe that recognition rates have lowered in relation to Afghanistan in 2016. Because with the exception of Italy and France, which have a small rise of 2%, all AIDA countries, which are the 20 countries that we analyze, have a lower recognition rate in 2016 than in 2015. And this is despite several reports showing that the situation in Afghanistan and the violence in the country is at one of its highest level in the past 10 years. Yet we see protection lowering. And the same goes for Iraq, by the way, where countries such as Spain, Poland, Italy, and Malta have recognition rates of over 90%. But Finland, Norway, Hungary, and the UK have recognition rates lower than 25%. Again, despite the fact that this is all about people coming from Iraq, nationals from often the same region in often the same situation. Yet it's a lottery. Depending on where you arrive, you might receive status or you might even not receive status. And then on the next slide, there's the next lottery part. Next lottery part being that as a Syrian, you don't necessarily get refugee status. It's also a lottery about which form of protection you get granted. I have explained to you a few slides ago that there are two statuses, refugee status, subsidiary protection status. And so despite common standards set out in European legislation, different countries have continued to grant different statuses to people seeking protection. So for instance, when you're coming from Syria, we see that Italy and Ireland have very high rates of refugee status granted to Syrians, with even 100% of Syrians arriving receiving status in Ireland receive refugee status. So once Ireland says, okay, you have right to refugee status, you're always refugee. You're not the lower threshold. You're not subsidiary protection. But you do have countries like Sweden and Spain where people fleeing from Syria are granted subsidiary protection status. For instance, in Spain, there's only a 0.9% of Syrians receiving refugee status. So basically, you might come from Syria, from the same village as you might be in the same situation as your neighbor, and if you end up in Spain, you have a 0.9% of being recognized as a refugee, whereas in Ireland, you will have a 100% chance of being recognized as a refugee. Again, this is a lottery. You just need to be lucky. And then we have a third type of countries. And the third type of countries is where the practice is not straightforward. Some of the people coming from Syria receive refugee status, and some of the people receive subsidiary protection status. A practice observed in Bulgaria and in Germany is that we've seen a shift in the past year, a shift from granting refugee status to subsidiary protection status. Whereas in 2015, only 0.06% of Syrian nationals received subsidiary protection in Germany, this number rose to 42% in 2016. So whereas before Germany would always grant refugee status for people in this situation, Germany has now decided to grant a lower form of protection in a lot of cases and grant subsidiary protection status. In Bulgaria, we see the same development where the number of subsidiary protection beneficiaries rose from 14.8% to 40.8%. So either in Bulgaria as well, this is an incredible increase of granting the lower form of protection. However, I must give some positive news again as well. And the positive news is that in the UK Home Office, there's been a positive shift, and UK Home Office has announced that in the United Kingdom, as of the 1st of July of 2017, people resettled from Syria will receive refugee status, which is new. That was not happening before. Now, what does it mean? What is the difference for people in practice? And I think this is very important for you teachers, because what is the difference between a child of which the parents have received subsidiary protection status or refugee status? These kids are the exact same. They're in the exact same situation, but they have difference in rights. And so the result of this lottery is that in the aftermath of the large-scale arrivals in Europe in 2015, the year 2016 was marked by national measures aimed at restricting family reunification for those granted protection. Family reunification is a system where not your whole family is in a country, but you can have certain family members come over. The amount of family members is different from country to country, but you can have certain family members flown over and arrived in your country, which is a legal pathway. This is one of the few legal ways that people can receive status and that people do not have to cross the sea or do not have to cross desert in order to reach Europe. Um, so this is a good way. This should be a good practice. However, we've seen that in 2016, a lot of countries have restricted this, and often more for subsidiary protection beneficiaries than um, for refugees. So we've seen that in 2016 and 2015 there have been restrictions in Austria, in Germany, in Sweden, in Hungary, in Ireland, Denmark, and Finland. These countries have all imposed stricter conditions on the enjoyment of family reunification. And this is a great illustration of the asylum lottery, because depending on what kind of status you get, you might either be able to have your wife come over or you might not be able to have your wife come over. And this is partially owed to the ambiguity of EU law. Several countries have even excluded subsidiary protection beneficiaries from the right to family reunification, contrary to what the Commission actually advises. So, for instance, in Greece, Cyprus, and Malta, subsidiary protection beneficiaries are fully excluded from the right to family reunification. So if you get recognized as a subsidiary protection beneficiary in Greece, you have no right to have your family come over. Whereas if you get recognized as a subsidiary protection beneficiary in a different country, you might have the right to have your family over. And if you get recognized as a refugee in Greece, you can have your family come over as well. In Sweden, they have also restricted family reunification for subsidiary protection beneficiaries for the coming 3 years, from July 2016 to July 2019, which is very arbitrary because it's only for these 3 years. So if you arrived 2 days before the entry into force of this law, then you did have the right to have your family come over. But as soon as this law entered into force, you did not have the right to come over, which is another form of lottery. Again, it all depends on luck. If you've arrived before the date, lucky. If you've arrived after this date, unlucky. And the same goes for Germany, who has recently excluded subsidiary protection holders from family reunification from March 2016 to March 2018. Beyond these cases, at least four countries, Austria, Hungary, Switzerland, and Serbia, afford some form of preferential treatment to refugees compared to subsidiary protection holders. This could be, for instance, shorter waiting periods before an application can be submitted, maximum deadlines for submitting an application, or material requirements such as an income threshold, accommodation, or health insurance. A similar issue is the fact that the duration of residence permit often differs for the different categories of beneficiaries. 21 out of 28 European Union member states grant less security of residence to beneficiaries of subsidiary protection. For instance, refugees in France receive a 10-year permit, whereas people with subsidiary protection only receive a 1-year card. So if you get recognized as a refugee, you do know that you will be able to stay in France for 10 years. Whereas as a subsidiary protection beneficiary, only 1 year, which is a huge difference and which causes a lot of uncertainty. And this is the same in relation to travel documents, because most countries issue travel documents with a shorter validity for recognized refugees. So the final issue that is related to the asylum lottery is citizenship. The Refugee Convention, the 1951 Geneva Convention, orders states to make every effort to expedite naturalization proceedings and to reduce as far as possible the charges and costs of such proceedings for refugees. Meaning, make it easy, do not make it too hard to get naturalizations. Don't make it harder for refugees abroad. However, the EU has chosen not to regulate this, since this would interfere with the national member states' sovereign power. This results in a widely divergent set of conditions in order to acquire citizenship. The central conditions to receive citizenship is a minimum period of residence in the country of refuge. National frameworks do not only vary considerably as regards to waiting periods for naturalization, but also in relation to the differentiation of refugees from subsidiary protection beneficiaries. As you can see on the slide, between refugees and subsidiary protection beneficiaries in Austria, the wait differs 6 years, meaning if you accidentally get recognized as a subsidiary protection beneficiary, you have to wait 6 years longer than if you would have been recognized as a refugee. In France, Spain, Italy, and Hungary, the difference is 5 years. Other countries have shorter difference, but out of the 20 IDA countries, only 8 of them provide for equal rules on minimum periods of residence, which is very strange. And another illustration of this lottery, depending on where you arrive, depending on which status you get, which is practice that can easily change, you might have to wait up to 6 years longer in order to be recognized as a national of that country, which then grants you a lot more rights. Some other differences in countries are not laid down in law, such as in Malta. In Malta, naturalization is at the discretion of the authorities in the absence of a written policy. There's no legal law on that, so the authorities can choose, which has resulted in a situation where subsidiary protection beneficiaries basically are not considered for naturalization. Finally, there are also differences differences related to access to the labor market, to freedom of movement, to social welfare. So depending on the status you get, depending on the country you get, there's a huge, huge difference. So it's not as much as a common European asylum system as we think. This common European asylum system idea is pretty good. It's based on the fact that everything is the same in every country. And it doesn't matter whether you arrive in Bulgaria or in Sweden or in Belgium or in Greece, it would all be the same. You would be in the same situation. You would be recognized either refugee or subsidiary protection beneficiary, and you would be granted the same rights no matter what country you would receive a status in. However, as I've just shown, this is absolutely not the situation. This is not happening in practice. In practice, the situation is not straightforward at all. Quite the contrary, the situation of these people is often marked by insecurity and injustice. People coming from a similar situation in a similar country can often end up with a completely different set of rights, depending on the country they arrive in and what that country's practice is. So the reason I'm telling you all this is that you might have students in your class and you might be thinking, great, these people have been recognized. It's not over. It does not mean everything is well. And it's very important that we realize that these people still often have problems. They have problems with residence permits. They have problems with family reunification. They have problems with citizenship. And I think that's one of the important missions that I wanted to give you, that it's a lottery and it's very hard to compare the situation of people. It's hard to compare the situation of a child in Greece to a situation of a child in Sweden to a situation of a child in Bulgaria to wherever country you're talking about. And I think, I hope I've learned you something by this, because what I see often in the discourse is that people say, oh, great, you're a refugee, so your situation is solved now. It does not mean it's solved. It does not mean all is smooth. It does not mean all goes well. And I hope this has been of a bit of use to you. And so this is where I would like to conclude my presentation. And I'm obviously ready to answer any views or opinions you might have. You're also always free to tweet me, to tweet ECRE, to contact me through Facebook, to contact ECRE through Facebook. You can find my email address on the website of ECRE. There's a lot more info on the website of ECRE about everything I've told you. All our documents are there. And I think if you have asked questions during the chat, I have not had an opportunity to look at the chat yet. I will happily um, engage in a conversation with you right now.
Great, thank you, Ruben. It has been really, really inspiring. At least myself, I was not aware of these facts or numbers or the difference between being a refugee or subsidiary protection and all these countries. So thank you very much for letting us know. And I think it's a problem that we should all be aware of. So thank you for sharing this very inspiring webinar with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. You're very
Okay,
welcome.
we have a couple of questions. So we are running a bit late, but let's try to answer these questions. So one is coming from Maria,
Yep.
and she wants to know
Mhm.
that you, with your knowledge and expertise and everything, if you can make a prediction of the temporal stability of the problem by 2020. So how do you think it's going to be in 2020 to indicate a date she mentions?
Um, it depends very much. What could happen by 2020? There are several scenarios. The scenario I hope for is that the European Union will take its responsibility and that the European Union will come up with an actual common European asylum system where they take matter into their own hands, assess cases of migrants and refugees arriving, and they treat the cases the way they should be treated. And do not exaggerate in calling this our problem or talking about flooding and not externalize it. Because that's the other option that it might happen. And it seems like the way the EU is currently behaving is to externalize the problem and close our border. We're already closed Fortress Europe um, and completely close our border and push people back to Libya, to Afghanistan, to Turkey, and have people solve their solution there. And I'm a bit afraid that that is the way the EU sees this. You know, we keep the people out, and then as a way of pretending to be nice, we will from time to time resettle a few people, which is basically just picking a few people and then inviting these people to your country. But the numbers of resettlement are incredibly low, and I do not believe this is a durable solution because, as I said, the EU is by doing that not taking the matter in its own hands. Um, what I think will happen with the arriving of refugees is that I'm really, really hoping that conflicts in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Syria will be resolved by 2020. Because I'm sure you've
Yeah,
seen the news
yeah.
yesterday with the poison gas to the children. I think these are things where the world really needs to react immediately. These are things that cannot go unnoticed. So I'm hoping that the United Nations, for instance, and countries themselves as well take initiatives. The heartwarming initiative of France that I've said, showing a heartwarming a corridor, a humanitarian corridor, allowing people to safely arrive, is something that I hope we see more. I hope individual countries take their responsibility. Even though it's not a legal obligation, countries can still do more. And I hope that is what the situation will be in 2020. The EU acting the way it should be, problems resolved in the countries of origin, and national countries doing more than legally obliged.
Thank you, Ruben. So yeah, let's do that. Let's try to raise some awareness among the people. And there is another question coming from Bianca, and she's asking if you're gonna expand AIDA because Romania was not on the map.
Yeah. So the thing is always, the European Council of Refugees and Exiles is an NGO, meaning we're dependent on funding. We're always looking for funding, obviously, and we're always looking for interesting countries that we can add to our database. But obviously, adding countries to the database is then dependent on funding. We have expanded the IDA database quite a lot in recent years. We've gone from 12 countries to 20 countries in the past 5 years, and we're always looking for expanding. Personally, I hope that we could include Romania. Romania is one of the countries we're talking about expanding. The first country to be added is Portugal, on which discussions are actually happening behind my back today. They're happening in the room next to this. So that is the first country that will be expanded. But we're constantly looking for ways to expand the database, even if it's on a one-term basis. we're looking for that, and Romania is definitely one of the countries that would be very interesting in terms of cooperation with other countries. So yeah, we hope to include a lot of countries soon, but it's all dependent on funding and
Sure.
developments.
Okay,
So yeah,
thank you.
we'll
Thank you,
see.
Ruben. There is another question coming actually from our colleague Dassos, who is here. So I'm gonna give open the microphone for him and see if he can make
Sure.
the questions. Okay.
Yes, I can hear you, but
Yeah,
very
me too.
silently.
I cannot hear you properly. Can you switch off? Switch. Let me see. Ruben, can you hear him? Because I cannot.
Very
Can you
silently.
put up the volume? Volume up, maybe? Yeah, here, here. Go here. Talk now? Okay. Talk again. Ruben, are you still there? Okay,
Yes, I'm
let's
still
do
there. I'm still
something.
there.
Let's change. Let's come here, which is it's easier.
Okay, great.
Yes, hello. Sorry for that. That's
Hi.
okay. Just my. It was a really interesting presentation, and to be honest, I'm not really aware. I mean, of all this data and technical information. But you mentioned the crisis in the beginning. Do you mean the connection of refugee crisis with the financial crisis, or it was just about the refugee crisis? And also something about if you can suggest, in a sense, also a bit of bibliography. Of course, I assume the information from and the resources of ECRE are really useful, but also how you can see that history of Europe, in a sense, relates with refugees, because my background is more on history, so how it relates, because you mentioned many times lottery, and during the World War II, it was also a bit of lottery for people to survive. How can you see this kind of
Yeah.
constant, let's say, fear of Europe to deal with these issues again and again, and this kind of throwing, let's say, the hot potato, as we say? I'm from Greece, actually, from one European
Yeah.
country to another, from one prime minister to the other, etc., etc. I know that these are very broad questions, but unfortunately, I will really will be glad to read more on that. Or
No,
if
yeah,
you can suggest, as I
they're
said,
very.
a bit of bibliography, and Nair and I, we can upload it as well on the relevant section of this MOOC. So thank you for your time, yeah, and for your excellent presentation.
Well, thanks for your question. They're very interesting questions. And personally, when I was talking about crisis, I also meant solidarity crisis. Solidarity crisis being several things. As you said, it is partially linked to a financial crisis. What we see is that politicians often scapegoat refugees for things not going good in countries. Politicians often use refugees to say they're stealing our jobs, which research has shown is not true at all. There are more jobs lost to automation than that there are jobs lost to that there are refugees actually entering a country. Um, what can also relate to the financial crisis is the precarious position that we've put Greece in. Greece is a country of which we've known, because it was the previous topic the EU was very interested in, the Greek financial crisis, where we've seen a lot of difficulties in financial support of the country, of its own nationals. And so now what the EU has done is um, we have kept the pressure on Greece. There's a new kind of pressure on Greece, not just the financial pressure, but we've given Greece the biggest responsibility together with with Italy to solve this issue. So basically, we're saying, hey Greece, too bad you have a financial crisis, but now we have a new problem. Can you solve this for us as well? And we've given money for that, but it's not enough at all. We've given a bit of support, but also not enough at all. And so I think it's very much linked on these two topics. Where we're giving a lot of responsibility and looking to countries that have financial difficulties to solve this problem for the richer countries, while on the other hand, in these richer countries, the politicians blame refugees for internal financial problems. So I think these are two ways where financial crisis and solidarity crisis slash refugee crisis is very much linked. Um, on the topic of history of refugees in Europe. It's a very interesting fact to see that when the revolution in Hungary happened, a lot of people from Hungary fled all over Europe and were received in many different countries. Yet now Hungary is probably one of the worst examples in Europe in ways of recepting refugees, in the ways they treat refugees, with now even locking everybody up. Um, as of documents on the history of refugee treatment in Europe, I'm not really sure. I've read a few standard works, of which I can send you the links later. But I'm sure in your course you've seen quite a couple of those. But there's a lot of interesting publications showing that the EU has always been one of the big generous continents in terms of granting refugee status and of granting rights to refugees. But what we've seen lately is that we've become so proud of that we're lowering our standards lower than other countries. What we see, for instance, with residence permits is that a lot of countries lower their residence permit, saying that, yeah, we're very generous anyway. But for instance, when as a refugee you get accepted in Canada or the United States, you receive a permanent status. So as a refugee in Canada, you have the right to stay in Canada for the rest of your life. Whereas, as I've said before, in France it's 10 years, which is one of the most generous countries in Europe. And so that's a very strange thing. We've become so proud that we're lowering it that far, and that we're not seeing ourselves that we're lowering it too far, and that we do not have anything to be proud of anymore. Where we're blaming Donald Trump for building a wall, whereas Hungary is almost completely surrounded by walls. Whereas between Greece and Macedonia, there's a huge fence. Whereas the European Union is giving money to Turkey to take care of the refugee situation, and Turkey is literally building a border fence between Syria and Turkey, making sure that Syrians cannot even get out of Syria anymore. So we blame Donald Trump for building a wall, which is a disgusting thing to do. But we're doing it ourselves as well. We're not that much better. And I think our pride has gotten a bit in the way of that in the recent history. But to give you an overview of publications, I'm not entirely sure. What I personally think is an interesting publication is the one from the Klingendahl Institute I mentioned on the EU's external management. On the recent things that we're doing is giving money for security measures, whereas we see that in these third countries, this money is used for cameras and police and border controls and patrols, where actually the real problem is bribes and violence and gangs and authorities being corrupt. And so this report very clearly shows that. Other reports and organizations that are interesting is as Amnesty International. Amnesty International is an organization that has produced a lot of very interesting reports on the state of European asylum law. Obviously, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN's main body on this. Then ECRE, of course, which is the standard you should all follow. Um, and then there's different ones like the Fundamental Rights Agency called FRA. They also have a lot of interesting publications. And then there's EASO, which is a European Asylum Agency, which also produces some interesting information. So if you're looking for information on either your country or third countries, um, often these organizations have interesting reports on the situation in countries of origin, meaning what is actually happening in Afghanistan, what is actually happening in Syria, because we see things on the news sometimes. Sometimes we see there's been a poison attack in Syria, but we do not see that every day people die in Syria. We do not see that in Afghanistan people die every day. We do not see that certain tribes prosecute other tribes. This is not shown all the time in media, in mainstream media. And so I think these organizations could be very interesting to follow because they often have what is called country of origin information. And there you could see what is happening exactly in this country, which for you teachers could be very interesting to know where this person is coming from, to know when a child is from Aleppo, what is the situation in Aleppo and why the fights have been so heavy in Aleppo. So this could be very interesting. And then if you're looking for information on your own country, on how your own country processes claims, or how the reception standards is, or when people are put in detention, in prison, um, then I think the IDA reports would be the main source, and they are often cited as the main source as well. So I think these are very interesting things as a bit of a bibliography to follow.
Thank you.
I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm in.
Yes, I
Okay,
can.
so great. Thank you, Ruben, for all this information, bibliography, and everything, and we'll look into it. And thanks also, Tassos, for your very interesting question as well. And that's it. I think we should finish here. It's 6:30, and we will share the recording. So for those who couldn't join today, they will be able to access the recording afterwards. Also to the participants, stay tuned to social media channels, Facebook group, course from Twitter. Answer the question of the week if you haven't done it yet. And have in mind that we'll have the integrating newly arrived migrant students in schools course starting on the 1st of May. So if you want to complete this as well, that would be nice. And that's it, Ruben. Thank you again for this very inspiring webinar, and I'm sure it's gonna be useful for the also for the people who were here this afternoon, and also for those who will see the recording afterwards. So thank you very much.
Okay, you're very welcome. And
Yeah,
if I
sure,
can
go
say
ahead.
one thing, keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you, and keep on doing this job because I think it's really worth it. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Thank you. Have a nice evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.